The route never changed. For over 40 years, Walter Grady drove the same bus route, Route 17, without fail. Rain or shine, full or empty, he followed every stop with silent precision. Most saw just an old man stuck in his ways. But something about that route wasn't random. Then one day, everything changed. A military vehicle pulled up to his final stop. 7 soldiers in faded uniforms stepped out, lined up, and raised their hands in salute. One stepped forward and whispered, "Bravo, Team 7. Reporting in full, Sergeant Grady." The crowd froze. Phones dropped. And the city that had once dismissed him fell silent. He wasn't just driving. He was honoring those who never came home. They called him Walter Route 17. Not because he owned the road, not because the route was named after him, but because no one, not even the youngest dispatcher or the newest GPS, knew that stretch of road better than he did. Walter Grady was a fixture of the city's public transit system. Quiet, reliable, always on time. Every morning, his khaki work shirt buttoned to the collar, cap perfectly aligned, he climbed aboard Bus 17 and began a route that rarely changed. And even when it did on paper, it didn't for Walter. He wasn't just a bus driver. He was a ritual. Long before he became a symbol of consistency, Walter had another title, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army. He had served in the jungles of Southeast Asia, officially a support technician, but unofficially part of a forward recon unit that operated in places not marked on any official map. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, maybe even somewhere deeper. Walter never said, because once the mission ended, so did the conversation. When he returned home, he didn't come back with medals or welcome parades. He arrived with silence, and he chose to stay in it. Walter never married, never had a family anyone knew of. He rented a small upstairs apartment above a closed-down hardware store, ate lunch at the same corner diner, always the turkey sandwich, no mayo, drank black coffee, read the newspaper from back to front, and left a generous tip without a word. He never missed a shift, not in 42 years, not for storms, not for holidays, not for funerals. To the kids waiting at stops, he was Mr. Walter. To the elderly, that gentleman with the kind nod. To the maintenance team, the one who leaves his bus cleaner than when he got it. But to the city's transport system, he was more than dependable. He was predictable to the point of perfection. Most drivers check their routes on a clipboard, or now, a mounted tablet. Walter didn't need it. He remembered every turn, every incline, every newly added stoplight, and even the bumps in the asphalt before they were paved. He could anticipate construction detours before they happened, and still stay exactly on time. His muscle memory was astonishing. Even when new drivers were given training manuals, they were told, "Watch Walter for 3 days. That's all you'll ever need." But there was one strange thing. He refused to drive any route except Route 17. Not out of arrogance, not with an attitude, but with the quiet certainty of a man who knew where he was meant to be. The city was upgrading the sewer system, and they closed off 2 full blocks on Walter's route. Other drivers adapted, took alternate turns, arrived a little late. Not Walter. That morning, he pulled the bus to the edge of the barrier, shut off the engine, stood up and said, "Folks, you'll have to wait a moment." Then he got out and walked. From one end of the detour to the next, he stopped at each of the 4 affected bus stops on foot. Checked for anyone waiting, gave a nod to a woman with a stroller, helped an old man with groceries across the street. Then after confirming the way was clear, he walked back in total silence, restarted the bus, and continued the route. The incident sparked debate at City Hall. Some said he was being dramatic. Others questioned his mental state. But passengers that day, they remembered something else. They remembered how he paused at each stop, not like a man following protocol, but like a man paying respect. Rumors grew over time. Some said he had PTSD. Others thought he'd lost someone on that route, maybe a child, a wife, a brother. But no one could prove anything, because Walter never said anything, not about himself, not about the past, and certainly not about Route 17. He once told a trainee who asked why he stuck with the same loop, "Because I haven't finished it yet." The younger man laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. But Walter didn't smile. As the years passed, newer drivers came and went. Uniforms changed, Technology advanced, but Walter remained. The community started referring to the bus itself as Walter's route, as if he had become part of the machine, part of the road. Even those who had never spoken to him somehow felt they knew him, like seeing a lighthouse every morning on the horizon. You don't have to talk to it. You just feel safer knowing it's there. And Walter, he kept driving. Same route, same time, same stops. Because to him, every stop was more than a name on a map. It was a coordinate etched into memory. Not of a city, but of a battlefield. Progress came with a spreadsheet, a new initiative from City Hall, urban transit modernization, promised to cut costs, reduce delays, and automate decisions through AI and GPS. Every bus, every route, every stop would be optimized. Data would replace instinct. Algorithms would dictate efficiency. And according to that data, Route 17 was no longer viable. Low ridership, overlapping coverage, inefficient detours. The system flagged it red and moved on. To the transit board, it was just another cut in the budget plan. To Walter Grady, it was the end of a ritual 42 years in the making. We appreciate your service. That's what the letter said. There was no handshake, no retirement party, no plaque, just a folded letter in his mailbox offering two choices. Step down, or switch to Route 9, which serviced the uptown retail sector. Walter didn't fight it. He didn't respond. The next morning, he simply didn't show up. For the first time in 4 decades, the 6:10 departure from the North Depot was silent. Meanwhile, in the back office of the now empty Route 17 Operations Center, a young intern named Kyle Reynolds was tasked with clearing out old paper files before the AI system went fully digital. Kyle wasn't important. No one really spoke to him. He was the kind of intern who fetched coffee, labeled folders, and stayed out of the way. Until he opened drawer C and pulled out a crumpled sheet of laminated paper, marked with grease, fold lines, and fading red ink. It was a hand-drawn map, unlike any route layout he'd seen in the system. The stops weren't labeled by street names. They were marked with alphanumeric codes: H2, Ridgeline F5, Tree Point L9, Echo Watch, Z7, Fallen Nest. Kyle blinked. He wasn't a military buff, but these didn't look like transit codes. They looked tactical. Sir, I think you should see this. Kyle hesitated to say anything, but something about the markings stuck with him. That night, he posted the image on a small online forum for veterans and military cartographers. The next morning, his inbox was full. Strangers asking, "Where did you get this? Is this real? Who gave you permission to share Echo Ridge coordinates?" One message came from a retired city council member, Major Ellis Harper, former U.S. Army Artillery Coordinator and the only veteran on the Transit Planning Committee. Within 12 hours, Kyle was sitting in his office, across from the man who had fought in Southeast Asia, and knew what those designations meant. Ellis adjusted his glasses and stared at the printout, his face drained of color. "This isn't a bus route," he said, almost whispering. "This is Hill Echo Ridge, the one that never made it into records." Kyle didn't understand. Ellis leaned in, the weight of old war stories heavy in his voice. In 71, there was an op, unofficial, classified even from most of our own. Recon unit got caught in a kill zone. Extraction failed. Whole team presumed dead. But someone made it back. Someone who walked it alone, under fire, point by point. This map, these codes, this is the path he took. Ellis looked up. Who was on Route 17? It didn't take long to find him. His personnel file had no military record. Not surprising for men in covert units. But his address, still the same apartment above the shuttered hardware store, had a small American flag taped to the window, next to a faded photograph of a younger man in jungle fatigues. Ellis stood outside the door for 5 minutes before knocking. Walter opened it slowly, said nothing. Ellis didn't waste time. "Sergeant Grady, Bravo Echo Ridge?" Walter's shoulders tensed, barely. He didn't answer. But he didn't need to. The war wasn't something he spoke of, because the war wasn't something that had ever ended for him. Back at the council office, Ellis laid the transit map from the Route 17 archives over a declassified topographic map from Southeast Asia. The match was perfect. Not just the stops, The spacing, the turns, the contours. Even the time between each stop on Route 17 lined up with the exact time a soldier on foot would need to crawl, wait, move, or carry a wounded comrade. He had recreated his path, day after day, year after year, and no one noticed. Until now. At the next City Hall meeting, Ellis requested to speak before the vote on finalizing the automated transit changes. He stood in front of the mic, unfolded the route map, and held it high. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you're looking at is not just public transit infrastructure. It's not inefficient. It's not outdated. It is a battlefield trail, walked by one man, alone, under fire, for the sake of others." Silence. He pointed to the map again. "You didn't just retire a bus driver, you silenced a memorial in motion." Meanwhile, back at the depot, Walter returned to the depot not as a driver, but as a ghost passing through memory. He didn't ask for his job back. He didn't need to. People began to understand. At first, just a few passengers showed up at 6:10 a.m., standing quietly at his old stop. Then came veterans. Then came news cameras. Then came school children who had never ridden a bus, but held handmade signs that read, "Thank you for your service, Mr. Walter." Long before the city knew him as the quiet old bus driver on Route 17, Walter Grady had another name. Echo 21, Liaison Scout, Forward Recon, attached to a deep insertion unit in Southeast Asia during the final years of the war. An operation so buried in red tape, politics, and shadows that even the soldiers involved weren't fully briefed. The only thing they knew was their call signs, their path in, and that they weren't supposed to be there. Their objective had no official name, no map, no medal, just a ridge. Echo Ridge, the men called it. A narrow highland trail straddling hostile territory, laced with fog, sniper points, and tripwire traps. It was the kind of terrain no man should have to navigate, especially at night, and especially under radio silence. Walter's unit was inserted with the expectation of a 48-hour observation. But 18 hours in, it all fell apart. A burst transmission intercepted, a perimeter compromised. Then, hell. The first mortar struck before anyone heard the whistle. The second landed closer. In under 3 minutes, 9 men were dead. Walter didn't run. He couldn't. He crawled, dragging a wounded radio operator with him through mud, vines, shattered jungle. He didn't fire back. He didn't make noise. He remembered every path, every sound, every shadow, as if his mind had already memorized the way out. It took him 3 days. He moved only at night, carried the wounded until the man bled out in his arms, marked the place he left him with a scrap of his own uniform, and whispered his name before leaving. He kept going. At one point, Walter reached a crossroads in the high brush, 2 possible slopes downward. He didn't hesitate, took the left trail. Later, he would learn, the right trail was mined. 3 months later, when a different unit passed through, the mines were still live. They called it Grady's Fork. When Walter made it back to the extraction point, no one met him. He flagged a rescue chopper with smoke he wasn't supposed to carry. When the crew saw him, bloodied, eyes wild, clothing in strips, they didn't believe him at first. And when he finally gave his debrief, they said there was a mistake. That mission wasn't approved. No records exist of an Echo Ridge unit. You were never there. Walter wasn't reprimanded. He was quietly discharged. And the names of the men who died, they never made it onto any memorial because their unit never existed. Walter didn't fight it. He'd already seen too much. He knew that war had rules that weren't always written. But he never forgot the ridge. He drew it, over and over, on napkins, on the backs of receipts. He didn't keep those papers. He didn't hang them on walls. He burned every one, not to forget, but because he no longer needed them. He had already carved the map into memory. So when the city began hiring bus drivers, Walter didn't pick Route 17. Route 17 picked him. The city was young then. The streets were still forming. The neighborhoods just beginning to bloom. But for Walter, the grid wasn't random. Each turn of Route 17 matched a ridgeline path. Each bus stop marked a place where a man had fallen. Stop 3, Echo Watch, where Sergeant Mendez was hit by the first shell. Stop 5, Ridge Point, where two men tried to flank and never returned. Stop 7, Fallen Nest, where Walter left the radio man's body beneath a broken tree. And each time he passed one, he'd do the same thing. With one hand on the wheel, his other hand would lift to the windshield, and he would touch it gently. A silent salute. Passengers never noticed, or if they did, they thought it was a nervous habit. Maybe superstition. It wasn't. Rain, snow, empty seats, route delays. Route. He never missed, because it wasn't a job. It was a ritual. Even on days when he was sick, Walter would show up early, sit in the bus before anyone else, close his eyes for a few seconds before turning the key. Some drivers thought he was praying. He wasn't. He was listening for footsteps in the jungle, for the sound of branches cracking, for whispered code words long lost to time. Years passed. No one asked questions. The war had ended. The world had moved on. And Walter simply became the old guy on the 17. Even when the city changed leadership, added tech, swapped buses, Walter stayed the same. Because inside that quiet frame, behind those slow, precise movements, was a man retracing trauma. Not to relive it, but to carry it, because no one else had. There was one turn on Route 17 that always slowed Walter's hand. A wide curve past a small park. Most drivers took it without thought. Walter always reduced speed, not for safety, not for timing, but because that turn was where the ambush began. And every time he drove past it, he remembered the first scream, the flare of fire in the treetops, the moment he knew they wouldn't all make it out. And still, he never said a word. Walter never told anyone, not the city, not the press, not even the other drivers, because in his mind, it wasn't his story to tell. It belonged to 9 men who never came home, to a unit whose name was erased, to a war the world tried to forget. So Walter did the only thing he could. He drove. Same road, same stops, same ghosts. Because some memorials aren't built of stone or marble. They are built from memory, asphalt, and time. And every morning at 6:10 a.m., Walter Grady kept the promise he had made in silence. I'll walk this path until someone remembers. The city thought it was doing a good thing. After all, the future had arrived. Autonomous electric buses, voice-guided boarding, and smart stops with AI sensors. Public transit was about to become fully automated, and so someone suggested a small farewell ceremony for the last of the human drivers. A quiet retirement send-off. Nothing too extravagant. Just a podium. A banner hastily printed, "Thank you for your service, Mr. Walter Grady," and a few folding chairs set up outside the depot. Walter arrived early that day, just as he always had. Not in uniform, not with any fanfare, just his same gray windbreaker, pressed slacks, and polished shoes, the same pair he'd worn every day on Route 17 for decades. He took his seat quietly, nodding politely to the handful of city officials who barely knew him. The mayor gave a speech full of scripted gratitude. A councilman read a few statistics. One intern passed out coffee that no one drank. No one clapped. Not because they were ungrateful, but because no one really understood what they were thanking him for. Walter just sat there, hands folded, eyes down, not bitter, not sad, just done. Then just as he reached for his cap to leave, the sound of heavy wheels echoed down the street. It wasn't part of the ceremony. No one had ordered it, but it came anyway. A military Humvee, old, worn, still in olive drab, pulled up to the edge of the sidewalk. Every head turned, doors opened, and 7 men stepped out, slowly, deliberately, wearing faded service uniforms that hadn't been seen in public in decades. No medals, no rank, just insignias long since decommissioned. They weren't young, but they stood tall. Each man straightened his spine as if shedding years of age and memory. And without a word, they walked to where Walter sat and formed a line, in perfect formation, boots aligned, shoulders squared. And then, together, they saluted. Walter didn't move at first. His hand froze just above his cap. Then the man in the center stepped forward. He had a scar down the right side of his jaw and eyes that looked like they had once stared down death and smiled. He leaned in, just close enough that only Walter could hear him. "Bravo, Team 7. Reporting in full, Sergeant Grady." Walter's hand dropped, not in shame, but in relief, because the man speaking, the one in the center, was Private Darren Price. Walter had carried him for miles, wounded, delirious, nearly dead. Walter had buried his tags in the jungle and carved his name into a tree, thinking no one would ever know. They'd told Walter he didn't make it, that he'd bled out before the chopper came, that no one survived the ridge. But here he stood, alive and saluting. The crowd froze. Phones that had been held casually dropped to people's sides. The mayor stopped mid-sentence. A child clutched her mother's hand. A teenager in the back whispered, "Who is he?" No one answered, because the city that had once dismissed Walter as just a driver finally saw him, not as a man in uniform, but as something far greater, a keeper of names, a guardian of the fallen, a soldier who'd walked the same battlefield every day so no one else had to. Walter stood slowly, took a deep breath, and for the first time in over 40 years, he returned the salute. Not as a driver, not as a citizen, but as Sergeant Walter Grady, Echo 2-1, reporting back for duty one last time. Then with trembling hands, he reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a small, faded map. Not a transit map, not a modern printout, just a creased, hand-drawn sketch with markings only he and 7 others could read. He handed it to Private Price. "They said this route wasn't needed anymore," Walter said softly, "but you and I both know it always was." Someone in the back, an old veteran with a cane, stood up, then another and another, until the entire crowd was on their feet. No music, no anthem, just the sound of boots on pavement and hearts remembering something they had never known. In that moment, Walter wasn't alone, not anymore. And Route 17, it would never just be a bus line again. The story of Walter Grady didn't end with a speech. It ended with a silence far louder than any applause. In the days following the farewell ceremony, something shifted across the city. People who had never ridden Route 17 began asking about it. Old veterans showed up at former bus stops, standing still with hands in pockets. Teachers began bringing students on walking tours, tracing the curve of the route like a memorial path. And then the city council voted, unanimously. Route 17 would not be erased. The old line was renamed Echo Route Memorial, not a functioning transit path, but a walking and biking trail, marked with 12 stainless steel plaques along the original bus route. Each plaque bore a small engraving, coordinates, a brief military code, and one line of anonymous dedication, "Position held, never forgotten." At the final stop, where Walter had once parked his bus every evening, turned off the ignition, and sat in silence, stood a small curved stone wall. On it, etched in black steel, in memory of the men who never came home, but marched in his steps. It didn't list names, because no names had ever been officially recorded, and that was the point. When the city invited Walter to speak at the dedication ceremony, he politely declined at first. Not because he was ungrateful, just because he never wanted the story to be about him. But eventually they convinced him. So he stood, not behind a podium, but beside the final marker of the Echo route, in front of a small crowd of veterans, families, and quiet strangers who had come to pay respects to people they never knew. He looked down, then up, and with a voice steady but weathered, he said, "I don't want anyone to remember my name. I just hope they don't forget theirs." And with that, he stepped back, folded his hands behind his back, and said nothing more. Walter never returned to driving, but every morning he was seen walking along the route. Never the full path, just a few stops. Sometimes he carried a thermos of coffee, sometimes a folded flag under his arm. Sometimes he just walked with both hands behind his back and the wind against his face. People would honk, wave. He'd nod, occasionally raise a hand in return, but never spoke of the war. He didn't need to, because now the city was speaking for him. Local artists created a mural titled "The Man in the Map," a painted silhouette of Walter's bus crossing a winding road that subtly shifted into a jungle ridge. Hidden within the bends of the road were ghost-like outlines of 7 soldiers walking behind the bus, fading into fog. The mural wasn't signed, but at the bottom in small block print, someone painted the words, "The route never changed." It didn't take long for other cities to notice, other veterans to write in, other families to ask, could there be more like him? And perhaps there were. Perhaps in another town, an old janitor who never missed his shift, or a crossing guard who saluted every car, or a mailman who walked the same path for 50 years. Not just to deliver letters, but to walk a memory that no one else could carry. Walter never claimed to be a hero, but by walking, by remembering, by honoring what was lost in silence, he left behind something far greater than medals or statues. He left behind a living map, a reminder that sometimes the people we overlook the most are the ones carrying the weight of history beneath their quiet footsteps. Sometimes history doesn't come with a parade. Sometimes it rides the morning bus in silence, with a man who just wanted to finish a promise. Walter Grady never asked for recognition. He didn't want applause, or medals, or a name engraved in stone. All he wanted was for someone, anyone, to remember the names of those who never made it home. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of legacy worth thinking about in today's world. In a time where everything is fast, loud, and always online, Walter chose quiet. He chose consistency over attention, duty over reward, and memory over noise. What does that say about us? Are there people in our own communities, bus drivers, janitors, mail carriers, grocery clerks, who we've passed by without ever wondering what weight they carry behind their silence? Maybe they're not just doing a job. Maybe, like Walter, they're marching in someone's footsteps. And so we ask you, what stories are hidden in plain sight around you? Maybe your grandfather never talked about the war. Maybe your neighbor stands for the flag a little longer than most. Maybe your Sunday morning coffee companion once carried a rifle instead of a thermos. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below if you or someone you love has a quiet ritual that might be honoring a memory few people know about. Have you ever met someone who, like Walter, seemed ordinary until they weren't? And here's a deeper question. Do you think we, as a society, do enough to honor those who served quietly? Not just during war, but in peace after the guns have gone silent. Let's start a conversation worth having, because this story isn't just about the past, it's about how we choose to remember and who we choose to see. Thank you so much for staying with us through this journey. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who still believes in honor, memory, and quiet strength. We create these stories to honor voices that often go unheard, and every like, comment, and subscription helps those voices carry further than they ever thought possible. Until next time, remember, some heroes wear uniforms. Others just drive the same route and never miss a stop. We salute you, Walter, and all those still marching quietly in their own way.